Good morning, everybody. Yeah, that was a combination of Monday and morning. Good morning. Good morning. Give it up, Dan. You're not good at this anymore. Welcome to the Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Slow down, Bespris. You almost biffed that one, too. Can't biff it live on YouTube or Twitter. Recorded podcast. We could get rid of this evidence if I wanted to. But I actually kind of like you guys knowing that I'm an idiot. Because then when I do idiotic things, there's no backlash or surprise. Because idiots act like idiots. Yes, indeed. Some galaxy brain action right there. I am Dan Bespris. Still at Dan Bespris on Twitter. DANBESBRIS. And this, of course, is an Old Man Squad Sports Network presentation. As of right this moment, there are 2 shows on the Old Man Squad Sports Network. By the end of this week, there might be as many as 6. It's been freaking awesome how many of you guys have come out to discuss either bringing an existing show over to the network, starting a new show, because the whole purpose of this is to bring enthusiastic, passionate people together who love to podcast and broadcast and just build and lift. So far, I'm freaking touched. It's not the point of today's podcast, though. The point of today's podcast is twofold, actually. Fold number 1 is, this is a show I actually wanted to do later in the off season, but I ran out of time today because I forgot that my older kid had his end of year, music thing at school. It was adorable, by the way. I don't want to sound like I'm complaining, but I didn't get home and get started on my day for an extra 2 hours because of driving and waiting and inability to mush things together. And then there's stuff at the end of the day and so on and so forth. So this was a show that was kind of already in the hopper. This was an easy one to do. We're going to do it now. The other fold, because what I wanted to do today, this is a shaky thought process here. What I wanted to do today was start to get into the Yahoo how did we do kind of thing. So we'll compare ADPs to final rankings and see how things matched up, because I think we can take a lot away from that as we look at the following year. Okay, this is where we can take some shots. This is where you're sort of balancing different things. That's been extremely illuminating season over season, and hopefully we'll have time to get into that tomorrow, but there's actually a lot of prep that goes into those shows. It's like a big chunk of prep, and then I can do 5 shows on it, but I have a bunch of time at the front end. And I know it's stupid to say that on a Monday after a whole weekend, but if you have multiple children, nobody gets anything done on a weekend other than the children. Children get a lot done. So today's show, we're going to look at a couple of players. And, the thumbnail has Steph on it, but he's not the only one. There are some long time, some extremely long time, and some slightly shorter, but, long enough time guys that we can point at and say, look, these guys were bona fide first round per game dudes for a very long time. And then this year, they weren't anymore. And we're going to try to figure out why that happened. What is it something obvious? Is it something underlying? Is it personnel? Is it age? Is it a blip? That is to say, will there be value coming back on these guys in the future? Or is this here to stay? So let's start with the poster child of this, and that's Steph Curry, who, it's not that his numbers were bad this year by any stretch. 26.4 points, 4.8 3-pointers. So, continues to be hyper elite in that because, he's Steph damn Curry. Let's see if we can make this big enough for everybody to see. Easier said than done. There we go. I think I got that in there. 4.5 rebounds, 5.1 assists, 0.7 steals, 0.4 blocks, 45% from the field on almost 20 shots, 92+% at the free throw line, and ranked number 22 in 9-cat. 2.8 turnovers per game, by the way, was also in the mix. So what happened? Well, the previous year, Steph was number 6. I know he missed some games. We're not going to worry about that total side. The year before that, he was also number 6, despite his role actually being pretty different each of the last 3 years. If you go back, not this season, not the previous one before that. So technically it's 2 years ago, but 3 seasons back, Steph averaged only 25.5 points per game that year. That's less than this season. 4.5 3-pointers, that was less. 5.2 rebounds, 6.3 assists, that was a little bit more that year. As we already mentioned, this year was 4.5 and 5.1. The big difference, 1.3 steals instead of 0.7. And he had a down shooting year that season as well. Only 44% from the field and 92% at the free throw line. And his turnovers were higher. And yet somehow he was number 6. There are a couple things at play here. Thing number 1 at play is that it's currently harder to get to the top of the board now than it was 2 years ago, which I know sounds completely insane, but it's true. Steph last year, when he was also 6th, and last year is when things really started to pivot because you started to see that big uptick in NBA pace. He was at 29.4 points, 5 3-pointers, 6 boards, 6.3 assists, 0.9 steals. Yes, a little bit lower than the previous year. 0.4 blocks, 49% from the field, and 91.5% at the free throw line. There was almost exclusively up from 3 years ago to 2 years, or to last year, basically. You guys know what I mean. 3 seasons back to not this most recent season, but the previous one. His scoring went up by 4 that year. Threes went up by half a 3-pointer. Rebounds went up by 1. I don't know where the hell that came from, but they did. Assists stayed the same. Steals went down by 0.4, which is notable, but field goal percent went up by 5.5%. It was a huge, huge jump in field goal percent. He went from being a pretty sizable negative there to a net neutral, but really a positive for a guard. And he was still number 6 because everybody around him got that much better at fantasy sports. Because the days of being in the top 6, averaging 25 points without something that is blow the roof off the building hyper elite, those days are just gone. Look at the top 6 guys this year. I'm sorry, I'm getting the years all screwballed here, but 3 years back, Steph, that stat line would not have had him in the top 6. And we know this because this year, Kyrie Irving averaged almost the exact same line as Steph in that season 3 years back, with 1.5 fewer 3-pointers and 6% better shooting from the field. And Kyrie was number 9 this year. This is what I'm talking about. He had almost the exact same season as Steph then, with, again, hit in threes. Steph obviously had more of those, but a huge, mega-sized jump in field goal percent. And Kyrie was about half the turnover mark of Steph from 3 years ago. Like, it's quite obvious that Kyrie's line this season per game was better than Steph's a couple seasons back, and he was ranked 3 slots lower. It's just harder to be in that top group. So that's part of what happened this season for Steph. When you see, like, look at him, compare him to Kyrie this year, frankly. Steph this year, as we just talked about, 26.5 points, almost 5 3-pointers, 4.5 boards, 5 assists. Yes, the lower steals were a factor, 45% shooting. Like, compare that to a couple seasons back, it's very, very close, and he's 16 slots lower. What's the market difference there? 0.6 steals per game is the market difference there. The other stuff is almost exactly the same. Slightly better field goal percent, slightly better scoring, slightly lower rebounds and assists. From a value proposition standpoint, you could take this year's Steph, transplant him back, not to the year before that, but to the year before that, and that line from this year is probably a first-round level line. There are just more guys up near the top now because it's pinball style numbers. It's absolutely bonkers. And yes, turnovers played a role. Someone like a Kawhi Leonard, who had really nice numbers across the board, the super low turnovers helped. Same story for Kyrie Irving. But then, look at like the top 18. Forget just the top 10. They're the top dozen. I mean, Kevin Durant at 11. I don't know if there's any better example of how absurd it is right now than KD at 11. KD was ranked 11th this year with 27 points, 2.2 three-pointers, 6.6 boards, 5 assists, 0.9 steals, 1.2 blocks, and a nice, fatty, positive contribution in both percentages. This dude, Kevin Durant, was a positive in fantasy in basically every category. It's basically a net neutral in steals and a little bit of a negative in turnovers, and that was good enough for 11th. That's absurd. Kevin Durant was number 2 that year, a couple seasons back that we were talking about with Steph. He was number 5 last year. And yeah, he did a little bit less offensively. Went from 29 points down to 27. But the rest of his stuff was, very damn near a carbon copy year over year. He was at 2.1 defensive stats this year. He was at 2.1 defensive stats last year. He was at 1.8 the year before that when he scored more. And his free throw percent was better. He was number 2. It's freaking impossible right now to be a top 5 fantasy player in the NBA. It's freaking impossible. The numbers that these guys are putting up are out of control. But taking that into consideration, is there any way that Steph can get back into that group based on what we know that it's going to take to get there now? It simply takes a different fantasy line to get into that top grouping. Forget top 5. Top 5 is absolutely impossible. I mean, the lines that Joel Embiid, Shea, and Jokic put up this year, they're absurd. They're outrageous. That Jokic is number 3 with 26, 12, and 9 and 2.3 defensive stats and 58, 82 splits. Like, what are we even talking about here anymore? Anthony Davis with his 3.5 defensive stats, 25 and 13 also. This is number 4. These lines that these guys are putting up are runaway number 1 type lines from just a few years ago. Luka had 34, 9, and 10, and he didn't completely obliterate your percentages anymore. And that was good enough for a distant 5th this year. Come on. What's Steph going to have to do to get back up in that group is probably the best question, because if he repeats himself, he doesn't get back there. That's not good enough anymore. He's going to basically have to do what he did this year. We're talking about Steph now. And he's going to have to shoot 50% instead of 45 if he wants any chance of getting back to the first round. That's how he gets there. Field goal percent goes back from being a negative to basically a net neutral. Could steals come back? That's the other thing that's kind of like fluttering as a question mark out there. Well, it's kind of hard to say for sure. As guys get older, that is a stat that tends to taper off a little bit, but this was also the lowest steals number per game of Steph's career by a lot. He has been trending down in steals since about 2018. He was at 1.5 to 2 the decade in the NBA before that. Since then, he's been at 1.3, 1, 1.2, 1.3, 0.9, and then this year 0.7, which, yeah, super low. Also, the minutes for Steph this year were the lowest since 2017, other than the year where he played 5 games and then called it a day. But not by an extraordinary amount. He's been near 34 a few times. And even though back in 2017, when he played 32 minutes, he played less than the 32 and change this year. He was at 1.6. So I'm inclined to believe that Steph's steals probably do come back a little bit. I don't think we're getting all the way to 1.3, 1.4. But from 0.7, one can pretty safely assume that it's not going any lower than that. Field goal percent is a question mark, because for his career, he's 47. When he has help on his team, it tends to be a little bit better. Shot selection's better. I mean, it's not like he shot the ball poorly from 3 this year. He was at 41%. He was at 43 the year before this. He was at 38 the season before that. That was the real down year. He's generally near 42. So 41's not all that far off. 92 at the free throw line, normal. Rebounding and assists down. He assists because he freaking needs more help. But he still took 19.5 shots per game, which is pretty much right where he's been for, the last decade. So there's nothing crazy there. So what do we need? What do we need for Steph to make sense as, a top 6 or 7 pick again? We need a hope. You need a wing and a prayer for a dude who's 36. I love Steph. Everybody loves Steph. He has, to some degree, single-handedly changed the way teams play basketball. He has had a huge impact on how the NBA functions and how players try to improve their game. Gravity and spacing. So I don't want this discussion to take anything away from Steph. But he's old. He's 36 years old. He'll turn 37 during this upcoming season. Guys do tend to taper a bit as they hit that. And I know LeBron, we can't talk about LeBron. He's not of this universe. And Steph's conditioning is still excellent. And I know he shot 49% last season. So anything is possible. But I don't think that we can just expect it anymore, where it's like, oh, Steph had a down year. Surely he'll be back at 48, 49 next season. For a long time, we could say that with him. Right now, I don't think we can just assume that he's going to be back 4 percentage points higher. Maybe the Warriors get better around him. Maybe that does the trick. But again, this is a down shooting year from 2-point land for Steph. And some of that comes when a guy just isn't quite as fast, mobile, quick, bouncy. All that to say, I don't think we know. Are the assists going to come back up? I don't know. Hopefully, if he gets help. Are the steals going to come back up? Probably a little bit. But is it enough to get him back to that top 8 or top 5 where he was for a while? Or frankly, the number 6 spot where he just hung out for a few seasons in a row? I don't think so. As much as I love Steph, and I don't see him dropping to be a guy that gets drafted at 18 next year. If he was, I'd do it because it's Steph. But I'd be floored. I mean, do we really think that Steph's going to get drafted outside the first round? I don't. I think he's going to go at probably 11. And I don't think that's far enough. Next name on the list I wanted to talk about today is Damian Lillard, who finished at number 25 this year. Yes, got off to a very slow start on the season. So some of that was slow start, hot middle, slow finish kind of thing. But this one, to me, is a little more cut and dry than the Steph situation. Because with Steph, you're kind of just making a bet on whether or not old age is catching up. And we never really fully know when that's going to be a thing. Because 2 years ago, he was playing through stuff. And that's why the percentages were worse. This year, he wasn't playing through injury. His team wasn't as good. Draymond was suspended for a while. Clay isn't Clay anymore. Andrew Wiggins has gone full pumpkin mode. Yeah, he had his Snow White year. So Steph has no help. But with Dame, now he does. So this is a situation kind of going the other way. Damian Lillard, who was ranked, frankly, pretty close to Steph this year, had a massive drop-off in the one category that is trouble. Usage. There are scenarios where usage doesn't equate to value 1-to-1. With Damian Lillard, usage equates to value pretty much 1-to-1 because he's not a massive steals, blocks, or rebounds guy. Those are kind of not all of them, but those are kind of the categories you can get when you're not the dude holding the basketball all the time. Pretty much everything else is tied to you touching the ball. Scoring, you have to be the one to shoot it. Threes, same deal. Assists, you can start the play. Field goal, free throw percent, and turnovers, good, bad, ugly, whatever, they're all tied to you holding the basketball. And with Milwaukee, Dame, we knew this going into the season. He was just never going to touch the ball as many times or finish plays or be the guy right before the play that finishes as he was in Portland. He was a one-man wrecking crew for Portland, especially after they traded CJ McCollum away. He was a top 3 fantasy play when he was alone, basically, with the Blazers at the tail end of the previous year before he got traded. He's been in that kind of, 5 to 10 range most years. Again, he had the season where he played just a couple of games and then shut her down. That was what, 20, played 20 something games, 21, 22 was the year for that. Otherwise, he's been in that same pocket forever with Portland for a whole decade, basically 10, 11, 12 years, something like that. His shots were always around, not the very beginning, but since 2015, we're at around 20 shots per game or a little bit more, depending on, again, whether or not he had any help with him. And he was scoring 27, 27, 26, 30, 29, 24 was the down year, 32 last season. And then this year, he joined a team with a true alpha in Giannis, and mind you, some other guys that take shots from time to time, like a Chris Middleton in particular. And his shots went from that 19 to 21 range down to 17 and a half. It's a big knock. We can forget for a minute the fact that he shot 42.5% from the field. Because, yeah, sure, that could be a little bit better next season. He's been, near 44 for most of his career. It's not a big jump, but it's also not nothing. The thing that's not going anywhere is the usage drop-off. We knew coming into this year that Dame was going to be doing less. It was unavoidable. The question we were asking was how much less? Well, now we know. A pretty good deal. Solid 10%, really. And then with the bad shooting, it ended up more than that. I mean, let's try to pretend that we don't really remember the year where everybody else got traded and it was Dame against the universe. Go to like 2020, 2021. That was a more typical Dame year in Portland where his help was not great, but there was a little bit. And that was 19 and change shots per game, 28 and 0.7 points per game. So 20 shots went down to 17 and a half. I mean, technically, that's more than 10%. That's like 12%, right? Yeah, something like that. So the points went down by 12%, and the threes went down by 12%. And actually, the threes didn't go down by, I guess, quite as much. And the assists stayed somewhat constant because he could throw the ball to Giannis, and that was useful. Field goal percent was ugly low. I see almost no path for Dame to get back to being a first rounder. But then I should also clarify and say I didn't really see a great path for him to be a first rounder this year. I thought Steph would. That massive drop off was more of a surprise to me than Dame because, Dame was always going to be a guy that his value was tied to how much he was doing because he was not that great in the non-usage categories. And you're like, look, if this is a guy who's like in that 7 to 12 range when he really has nobody else to take the ball from him, the question was, how far was he going to fall? Was he going to fall from that range to, 12 to 16? Or was he going to fall to the, 15 to 20 range? That was the question mark. For some reason, he got pushed up the board at the very end. Dame's ADP at the start of draft season was like 14, and then it pushed up towards 9 or 10, which was audacious. That was a saucy place to get Damian Lillard. As a result, I had him nowhere because at 14, I was like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. And at 9, I was like, no, absolutely not. I have no desire to take this guy who maxes out at 9 when there's nobody around, and now Giannis is around. So the only thing you're looking for next year when you handicap a guy like Damian Lillard is where is he getting drafted? Is he going to go towards the end of the second round? Because if that's the case, I'll take a shot on him. Because if the field goal percent bounces from 42 to 46, then he jumps up the board, not just in scoring, threes, field goal percent, all that stuff gets better. And he sort of, that's an opportunity for him to jump 6, 7, 8 spots just on field goal percent alone. So now suddenly he becomes an early to mid second rounder. But if he's still getting drafted, if he opens up at 18 and it pushes up to 15 or something like that, that's probably not late enough. Jimmy Butler is the next name on the list. He's more of a games cap darling type of play anyway, because Butler is never healthy. That's just, I mean, it's been forever, basically, since Tibbs wore him down in Chicago. I don't even know how long ago that was now. It's like 8 years ago. He played 76 games his final season in Chicago, and since then, he went 59 for Minnesota the following year, 65, which for him was kind of a big number the year after that. COVID year, he went 58 out of 72, and then they made the bubble finals, and that had a lingering impact. He went 52 out of 72 the year after that, 57 out of 82, 64 out of 82, and then 60 out of 82. So we're talking about a guy who pretty religiously misses between 15 and 25 games a year. Closer to 15 on a great year, closer to 25 on, frankly, most years. But we knew that. Everybody, we all know going into a year that Butler's not getting over 65 games. That's a max type of number. Kind of Kawhi-esque. Although, then Kawhi played a few more ball games this year. The reason to draft Butler, first of all, was going to almost always be on the roto side, for one, because once you accept the fact that he's going to miss 15 to 20 ball games, you're not going to take him in a head-to-head league. But you're taking him in roto because you're like, look, if this dude is getting drafted near 30, which happens annually with him because of injury stuff, and he's going to be, a top 10, 11, 12 range per game guy, which the last 2 years he was number 8 and then he was number 10 in Miami. There was pretty good reason to think that he could get close to that again. And then he ended up at 27. And it's basically one statistical category that did it. That category, mostly steals. The 5.3 rebounds and the 5 assists are admittedly a little bit lower than you'd want, but not all that far off from where they were last season. They were better the year before that, but Miami's been getting a slightly better supporting cast around Butler. Let's just compare last year to this year. Last year, 33 and change minutes per ball game for Butler, which is actually lower. He played more minutes this season. Jimmy was at 23 points, 6 boards, 5 assists, 1.8 steals, and 54-85 splits. This year, 21 points, so down a tiny bit, 5.5 rebounds, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, and 50-86 splits. The big difference for Butler there was steals. The year before that we didn't even look at, he was at 2.1 steals per game, and that's how he got himself into the top 8 in that one with, again, shooting 50%, like more like this year, as opposed to the 54 that was crazy high. So maybe we should have never assumed that 54 was repeatable. Fair. But the super low steals, I think, is the thing that needs to be at least partially analyzed. Jimmy Butler has been a hyper elite steals player for his entire professional career. Barring the first 2 seasons where he wasn't really playing starters minutes, he's gone 1.9, 1.8, 1.6, 1.9, 2, 2.4 for a brief stint in Minnesota before he finished up at 1.8 in Philly that year. And then in Miami, 1.8, 2.1, 1.6, 1.8, 1.3. Is it age? We just had to ask that about Steph. It could be. Butler's going to be 35 in 4 months. But there was no real obvious downward trend in this. In fact, it went up last year. There's been no obvious play to say, oh yeah, he's obviously slowing his spell. He took a few more 3-pointers this year, which, whatever. I don't think that had much of an impact on anything. He actually shot 41% from downtown this season while getting back up to 1 3-ball a game. Free throws were pretty much around where they've been. Maybe, not quite as many attempts per game, but not by much. From 8 down to 7.7. That's minimal. Yeah, they brought in some guys. That changed things a little bit, but that's not the reason that the steals were down. And so that's what you're now banking on next year. Because suddenly, Jimmy Butler getting drafted in the late 20s and his per game value sitting in the late 20s, well, now you've lost the upside. Because now you're dealing with a guy who's a quote-unquote hit, because you got the accurate per game number, but has almost no way of beating his ADP by totals because he doesn't play. He misses 20 ball games every year without fail. Miami may have some proving to do, and Butler's a guy that we've heard is maybe kind of rubbing things the wrong way. We'll see. I'll believe that when I see it. But he's long been a guy that fits the profile of the old man squad, like Kawhi Leonard, for the per game crops among us, because he's going to get drafted 2 rounds behind where his per game numbers are for a long time. And then you just take whatever games played you get. Admittedly, he's not a guy you're targeting on head-to-head side anyway. Okay, keep that. You have to hold that in the front of your brain as we talk about this. But even for games cap, I should say now, he's become a little bit more questionable. I do think you could or should even maybe see that steals number come back up a little bit next year. 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, something in that neck of the woods doesn't seem all that far-fetched. The other stuff feels relatively repeatable, barring Miami trading a bunch of stuff and bringing in some kind of superstar nearby him. But yeah, the other stuff seems like something he could repeat. You get the steals back in line. You probably move him back into the middle of the second round, I would think, because he's really not all that far away from being like number 19, 18, 19 range, especially if LeBron slows down at all. If, say, I don't know, Freddie VanVleet doesn't have quite as many blocks next year, or doesn't shoot 42%, goes back to 39 and change or something like that. So I think Jimmy Butler could still be a games cap guy. I think he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way this year, but I do think that what went wrong for him is something you could actually see semi rectify itself as you look towards next season. And then I wanted to do one kind of honorable mention type of play because he's a little more fringe drop off than these guys we just mentioned. But before I do that, a lot of you, as has been the case here since we started this new podcast, a lot of you are watching live on social media. And I would beg of those of you watching on social media to please subscribe to this show somewhere else. Because Twitter, though it may be great for getting information out quickly, is the only way you can take in this podcast where I see no benefit of any kind. That's not to me trying to be selfish or anything. I just frankly need you guys to subscribe some other way because not every show is going to be streamed live on Twitter. I try to do that as kind of like a bonus, but think of it this way. YouTube, hard to monetize, and I can't yet because we just started that new YouTube channel, but even once it does, it's pretty low. The canned audio only ones are the ones where I can actually get a little bit of money from the advertisers. Not that that's, again, your problem, but if you want to help, please continue to spread the word. Please go subscribe on some platform. All the links are in my pinned tweet. It's super easy to find. And if you're, again, watching or listening after the fact, you can see all the places that you can take in this show in the show description. The only place that doesn't have a show description, of course, is, you guessed it, the Twitters. Well. All right, last little honorable mention guy I wanted to talk about is Jason Tatum, because he was a guy that was already kind of teetering on the edge of the bubble the year before that, or the year before this, I should say. He was number 11 last season on 30 points per game, 9 boards, 4.5 assists. It's crazy, by the way, that that's good enough for 11th in fantasy these days. But you always knew that his role was going to get a little bit smaller with Porzingis and Drew Holiday coming to town. And so this year he dropped back to number 15, which, believe it or not, that's what he was the year before the explosion up to 30 points per game, where his shots went all the way to 21.1. Year before that, they were at 20.5. His free throws jumped up to 8.4 last year. They went back down to 6.7, which is pretty normal and now kind of in line with what you'd expect. But the big thing for Tatum is that instead of 20.5 to 21 shots, he's at 19.3. And I just don't see that going up markedly as we look towards the future unless his teammates change, which, does that look super possible? I'm going to say probably not. He's kind of doing as much as he needs to do right now on a team that in my eyes, he's still a super young dude, but every year that he gets older, the likelihood that he continues to play 74 games every single season is just not as high, frankly, because as long as they remain really good, they won't need it. Especially if the Celtics go to the title round and or win it. Oftentimes you can kind of fade championship teams in the regular season the following year just for maybe an injury crops up here or there. Maybe it's harder to get themselves fired up for the regular season, whatever you want to call it. So Tatum at 15 per game kind of feels right. Which, by the way, is fine. If you wanted to take him at like 10, 11, 12 and say, look, I still think he's going to be durable this coming year, take him at 15. He got there by totals. Again, he always jumps, 4 or 5 slots by totals just because he plays pretty reliably to this point. Now, again, if he goes to the title round and all that, whatever, the finals, could that shake things up? Yeah, anything can happen. But he was back to number 11 by totals this year too. He's one of those guys, and he's the reason that he's an honorable mention is that he didn't really hurt your team all that much this year. You probably drafted him at 6 or 7. He finished at 11 by totals. That's passable. It's not fun, really, but it's passable. He's fine. He was good. Not great, but good. And sometimes that's good enough because all you want to do, remember, don't lose your league with your first-round pick. And Tatum is basically never going to lose you your league as a first-round pick. So I didn't want to turn him into like, oh, yeah, we're going to knock him as well. But I think it is important that he scores a lot of points. People, we realize this, that he scores a lot of points, but that might not be enough anymore, given Jaylen Brown, Porzingis, Drew Holiday, so on. These other guys that are willing to take shots, and so he doesn't have to take 21 of them anymore. Final thoughts on the 4 players we covered on today's program. Steph Curry, probably worth a shot if he's drafted in the mid-second round or later, because if the field goal percent comes back up, he could jump to the front end of that second round. Brain fart. Who the hell was Damian Lillard, probably a no. Again, even if the field goal gets better, there's no way he gets back to the edge of the first round. Best case scenario for Dame is probably more like the 14 to 18 range. Jimmy Butler is someone that I think probably profiles as a guy you maybe want to take a shot on because I think he'll probably get drafted pretty late. Like my guess would be 30 or later on Butler in terms of where he gets drafted next year. I think Steph probably still goes maybe towards the turn. Dame probably gets drafted mid-second round. And then Jason Tatum probably still gets drafted towards the back half of the first round, which in my eyes remains fine. And those are my feelings on 4 guys. Are they getting old / worse, or did something just happen this year? Thanks for watching, everybody. Appreciate you guys finding ways to subscribe, finding ways to spread the word about my new network, my new show. Stay tuned to the Old Man Squad Sports Network. By the way, Old Man Squad is the umbrella Twitter handle for the shows that we will likely be launching this week. Should be a lot of fun. Don't think they're going to be fantasy shows this week, but maybe we might have another one by the end of this stretch. What it seems like is that there'll be a basketball show. Oh no, that's not true. There's a fantasy crossover show that's like fantasy baseball, some fantasy football stuff all rolled together. And then probably a baseball show, but that one would be me, as he points to his hat to indicate what might be happening there. Have a great Monday, everybody. Back at you tomorrow. We'll try to get that prep done so we can start looking at how the ADPs actually correlated to some final numbers, and we'll go from there. We'll have some guests coming up later this week. I believe we'll be talking to my good buddy Josh Lloyd on Wednesday. I think we're talking to Thunder Dan Palio on Thursday, and then I believe Matt Smith on Friday, assuming that my children stay healthy and we can all get these guest appearances recorded. But this was part of the reason that I wanted to do this project, is to do more collaboration. So why wait? See you guys tomorrow, everybody.